As you can see, I am making this program again from a location somewhere in Germany, and I will anticipate that I will be back in London on Thursday or Friday, at which point videos can resume in the normal way. Until then, once more to say I apologise for any problems in the picture or in the sound quality. I do my best in these conditions, though I should say that I'm enjoying my time in Germany. I'm having very interesting conversations with many very kind and interesting people, and I'm also, of course, enjoying the many attractive and wonderful things that Germany, a country of which I am always fond, many of the great things that Germany has to offer. Anyway, let's proceed with the program today, which, like all the other programs I'm doing whilst in Germany, is going to be shorter than most of my programs, most of the programs I do in London. And I'm going to return to the topic of the French elections, because today is a decisive day in those elections. And can I also say that we've now had final definitive results from the first round, and they seem to me to put Marine Le Pen and her party, the Rassemblement National, in an even stronger position than I had appreciated in my previous programs. So let's first of all sum up what the final results actually were. The Rassemblement National came first with 33.4% of the vote. The New Popular Front leftist coalition, led perhaps by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, though to what extent he actually does lead this movement, it seems to me is open to some doubt. Anyway, they came second with 27.99% of the vote, somewhat down on what the earlier suggestions, what the earlier forecasts had said. And Emmanuel Macron's Ensemble Alliance took 20.4%, which is also down on the results that I had seen when I saw the forecasts come out on Sunday and when I saw the early results on Monday. Now, the important thing to understand is that France is a very complex electoral system. It sort of combines elements of proportional representation with elements of first past the post. So what happens essentially is that we now have the various parties positioned in specific constituencies, and in most of those constituencies, the great majority of them, in fact, as I understand it, Marine Le Pen's party has now come first. So her party was first in most of the electoral constituencies. In those constituencies, the parties that were in second and third place get eliminated from the second round. Now, Macron's Ensemble party was apparently third in the great majority of constituencies across France. And that effectively means that at the conclusion of the second round, they will not be able to send MPs in any numbers to the French National Assembly. Macron's party, in other words, faces almost complete annihilation. When Marine Le Pen said early on Monday that Macron's party had been annihilated in the election, in terms of parliamentary representation, she spoke the truth. It is now impossible for Macron's party to emerge as a significant force in the French National Assembly. The only question now is, therefore, whether Marine Le Pen's party, the Rassemblement National, will receive enough second preference votes in most French constituencies to emerge with a majority in the French National Assembly. And this is an open question. One can't be certain one way or the other. On the one hand, her party is first in most constituencies. Apparently, in 20 constituencies, her party won outright in the first round, gaining 50% or more of the vote, which was apparently more than had been anticipated. But whether in some constituencies or in most constituencies, the non-Rassemblement National parties will combine to prevent the Rassemblement National coming through as first in the second round. That remains to be seen. I have to say that it looks at the moment as if the leaders of the various parties are busy giving away rather confusing and mixed signals. In the case of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, he appears to be saying that his supporters should support any candidate who can beat the Rassemblement National. So that's a significant number of votes which are stacked up in theory to vote against the Rassemblement National in the second round. But whether other votes from minor parties will follow the lead set by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, whether some leftist voters will follow the lead set by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, that remains to be seen. My own sense is that this endless game that has been played for decades now of trying to create what is called a Republican coalition to block what is invariably referred to in France as the far right is now almost played out. It has been played too often, too many times, and in too much disregard of the exact set of policies that the Rassemblement National and its predecessors and Marine Le Pen herself, both now and in the past, are saying that they stand for. And the other problem with this strategy is that what it has invariably done is that it has brought back into power variants of the same French establishment, neoliberal establishment, which it is clear is becoming deeply unpopular in France, and which, to say it frankly, has not governed particularly well. If French people felt generally content with the way things are, then some of them might be annoyed with the neoliberal establishment for some reasons, and they might follow the call to combine against the Rassemblement National and Le Pen. But my sense is that they're now so angry, they're so embittered against Macron in particular, that the sense is that they're more likely to unite against what's left of his party and him as well. And they are also less likely to unite against the Rassemblement National and Le Pen than they have ever been previously in other elections. So, whilst perhaps on the statistics and on the leads offered by the various party leaders, it looks difficult for the Rassemblement National to gain a majority. It's not entirely to be excluded. By the way, Marine Le Pen has absolutely correctly said that if the Rassemblement National does not win a majority in the forthcoming elections, she does not expect it to form the next government of France. She will not be held hostage to the other parties or responsible when things start to go wrong, which they inevitably will. The situation in France is extremely bad. And besides, by insisting that the Rassemblement National will only form a government if it is granted a majority following the second round, she's saying something which I think is likely to encourage more French voters to vote for the Rassemblement National, for the very simple reason that one thing now is absolutely clear: it is the only party that can form a government, that has any realistic prospect of forming a stable government after the second round of the election on Sunday. Now, I say that because we come back to the absolutely nihilistic policies, actions of France's President Emmanuel Macron, having apparently called an election, a parliamentary election, in the belief that by doing so, he would be able to unite all of French society behind his party by invoking the spectre of the far right, and having found that that calculation or gamble failed, it seems that his next gamble is to do something which I personally find shocking and even appalling. This is to prevent any party at all gaining a majority in the French National Assembly, creating an unstable and chaotic government at a time when the situation in the French economy is becoming increasingly unstable, with France's credit rating having already been downgraded, with France quite plausibly facing a fiscal crisis over the course of the next few months, and with increasing pressures in the Eurozone in general, the epicenter of which is the situation in France. In other words, the President of France, the person who is responsible for the future of France, instead of trying to provide France, working to provide France with an orderly government, seems instead to be working to create a situation of chaos. And his plan, to the extent that I can tell that there is a plan, is to foster chaos in the hope that the Rassemblement National and the French left, led by Mélenchon, will be blamed for the chaos, enabling Macron to call another election again in a year's time, at which point presumably he expects that he and what is left of his party will be the beneficiaries. It is an astonishing, reckless action by the French president. It is more like a child throwing a tantrum and smashing all the furniture when it doesn't get its way, but it seems to be what Macron and Macronism have degenerated into. For the record, I believe that if the Rassemblement National does win a majority in the second round on Sunday and does indeed form a government, then there is a high probability, or at least a high possibility, not, of course, a probability and not a certainty, because Macron doesn't consult me. I think there is a high possibility that Macron, rather than confront the unavoidable option of having to appoint Jordan Bardella, the parliamentary head of the Rassemblement National Prime Minister, that he will step down, opening the way for presidential elections, which on the basis of the results of the elections that we have just seen, both the first round of the elections, the parliamentary elections, and the previous European Parliament elections, presidential elections, which almost certainly would result in Marine Le Pen being finally elected President of France. So, a terrible mess that Macron has created from a neoliberal point of view, and he seems to be working in order to create an even worse mess going forward, but a chance, a possibility that his plans will miscarry. In fact, they're bound to miscarry. Though the damage they will do to France in the process remains to be seen. But anyway, a possibility that it will work out otherwise, and that the French might be rid of Macron in a week's time. Now, I would say to people in France that if they do want to be rid of Macron, if that is indeed their priority, and I suspect that for a great many of them it is, well, they now have a simple option, which is to vote for the Rassemblement National in the second round on Sunday. If the Rassemblement National wins a majority in the French Parliament, then at that point, Emmanuel Macron, the high probability, the possibility is that Emmanuel Macron will finally step down, and France will be rid both of him and, for at least a time, of the neoliberal project. Now, looking at the final results further, I'm going to make one final further observation, which is that it seems to me that at least as far as France is concerned, Project Ukraine is effectively sunk. I've said that it is now debatable whether Macron's party is going to get much representation in the French Parliament after the second round, irrespective of whether Macron chooses to stay on or not. The great majority of MPs, members of Parliament, deputies to the French National Assembly after Sunday will be from parties that have opposed Project Ukraine in one form or another, and which are clear in their opposition to Macron's dangerous ideas of deploying French troops to Ukraine. So I cannot see how, going forward, that plan of sending troops to Ukraine can now fly. Even if Macron chooses to remain president, even if Macron, as commander-in-chief, orders the deployment of French troops to Ukraine, he will face enormous opposition within the French National Assembly that can, in theory, deny funding for such a project. I have to say that I think that disastrous plan is dead in the water, and I further think and believe that it was Macron floating that plan in the first place, which partly explains why the results in the election, the parliamentary election, have turned out as they have. Well, one further thing. Yesterday, in the title to my previous video, I touched on the fact that the West is in panic about the fact that the elections in France have turned out as they have. Well, confirmation of this was provided by an unexpected source, Gideon Rachman, a journalist who is very much a part of the current establishment, writing in the Financial Times, perhaps the epitome of an establishment newspaper. Anyway, he's saying that liberals, by which of course he means neoliberals, liberals should not panic as a result of these elections in France. They should not panic over these elections or over the meltdown of President Biden in the television debate in the United States. So when people say that there is no cause for panic, or that people shouldn't panic because of bad news, that in my experience has always been a clear sign, a strong indicator that panic is indeed happening. And we have, as I say, I can get to treat that article by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times as effective proof of this. Whilst on the subject of the United States, I'm going to make one quick further observation, one that we've touched on in the program that we did, Alex Christoforo and I, on the Duran, which I suspect will be coming up shortly. But my own view is that after having urged quite publicly President Biden to stand down, and having seen that President Biden shows no willingness to stand down, and nor do his family, his immediate family, or his entourage, my sense is that the Democrats and the neoliberal establishment in the United States, having considered all the options, have come to the grudging conclusion that sticking with the president in the forthcoming election is their least bad option. Everything else, every other option that's been talked about, of trying to shift the president aside in some way or the other, opening up the convention to a battle, fielding the Vice President Kamala Harris as the primary candidate in the election, all other options are so unattractive and present so many difficulties that it's best to do. They've decided that the best thing to do is to make the best of a bad job. Cling on to Joe and hope that something between now and November happens that will turn everything right. I don't myself see what that might be, but to be frank, I too don't think that there are any good or very satisfactory alternatives. Anyway, there we go. Let's move on and discuss the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And when I said that the Democrats, the people who support President Biden in the United States, are perhaps looking for a miracle, it's not impossible that some of them might see that miracle in some kind of victory by the Ukrainians in Ukraine. But if so, they're going to be cruelly disappointed, because we've had a massive cascade of news again over the last 24 hours, and far from this news being good for the president or his supporters, on the contrary, it is extremely bad. It is clear that the Russians are pressing forward all across the front lines, and that the Ukrainians are crumbling. Now, before I discuss what's going on the front lines in detail, I just wanted to say a few things about a recent development on the mobilization front in Ukraine, which is that Ukraine is now mobilizing prisoners from its prisons and is apparently sending them to the front lines also to fight on the front lines. Now, I remember very, very well the commentaries, the many commentaries that were circulating in the media when Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were doing that very thing in the weeks and months of the Battle of Bakhmut in the winter and spring, in the winter of 2022-2023 and the spring of 2023. Prigozhin, as I remember, toured many of the prisons up and down Russia. He had pardons, which he'd been provided by the presidential administration in Russia. He asked convicts, he told convicts that any one of them that wanted to join up and join the Wagner organization would immediately receive pardon as soon as they'd completed their service with the Wagner organization, service which, from recollection, was due to last for 6 months, and tens of thousands of prisoners did so. And I remember that the media in the West was intensely critical of this whole process. There was talk about how the Russian army in Ukraine, including, of course, the Wagner Group, had become effectively a convict army. There was all sorts of sour comments about this. And to a certain extent, by the way, I was not in complete disagreement. I myself found this whole process uncomfortable. And I became even less comfortable when I learnt that the convicts that were being called up by Prigozhin and who were joining the Wagner group were getting only minimal training and were being used by Prigozhin and the Wagner group to carry out assaults in Bakhmut in order to capture ground rapidly at a faster rate than might either otherwise have been the case, and at the cost of terrible losses. And it wasn't just I who began to become concerned about this whole process. The Russian Defense Ministry started to become concerned about this whole process as well. And one of the issues that led to conflict between the Wagner Group and Prigozhin was precisely that Prigozhin was undertaking this practice, and the Russian Defense Ministry started to complain that it was inappropriate and wrong, and they started to say that Prigozhin should stop doing this. And eventually, a regulation was passed in the spring of 2023, actually forbidding the Wagner organization from recruiting in prisons in the way that they had done. By which point, however, thousands of former prisoners had actually died in the fighting in Bakhmut. Well, it looks like exactly the same thing is now being done by the Ukrainians. It also seems to be the case that many of these prisoners are being sent into battle with minimal training. I've seen suggestions, which, by the way, I cannot confirm, that in many cases these prisoners are not being given the option of whether or not they wish to join up or not. They are simply being mobilized and thrown into the battle, which I find terrible. Though I want to stress again, I'm not absolutely sure whether that is the case. And I noticed that the Western media that had been very critical of the practice when it was conducted by Prigozhin and Wagner are, on the contrary, not only happy, are not only unfazed or unbothered when Ukraine does it, but if anything, they appear to be cheering it on. So when Russians do something like this, it's terrible. When the Ukrainians do something like this, it's apparently fine. Brings me now to the topic of what is actually happening on the front lines. Well, the first thing to say is that last night apparently, the Russians carried out another massive missile strike in Ukraine, targeting this time primarily an airfield, one of those old Soviet airfields with which Ukraine is dotted, a major airfield near Mirgorod, which I presume is a city, is the place, the Mirgorod, which forms part of the Pokrovsk conurbation. And the Russians have provided film and photographs of the results of this airstrike. And certainly the film that I've seen appears to show one Ukrainian fighter jet. Some say a Sukhoi 27, though I'm not able to distinguish it clearly with my eyesight. Anyway, one Ukrainian fighter jet destroyed on the runway, but I heard reports that 6 others have been destroyed as well, and that 7 Ukrainian aircraft, which must now account for a sizable part of what is left of the Ukrainian Air Force, being destroyed on this airfield. Now, if this is the airfield near Mirgorod, this is a location very close to the line of contact. I've already spoken about how the Russian breakthroughs in Novo-Alexandrovka, Sokol, Yevgenivka, apparently now mostly under Russian control, have brought the Russians within medium-range artillery fire of Pokrovsk itself. Mirgorod is located to the northwest of Pokrovsk. Now, it's probably still just outside artillery range for the Russian military, but it is well within range of Russian ballistic missiles like the Iskander-M, if they are forward deployed, which presumably they are being, in order to launch strikes on this particular airfield. And I presume that that is what has happened. We see how the Russian advances on the front lines are now starting to undermine Ukraine's ability to operate aircraft so close to the contact lines. The airfields from which the Ukrainian aircraft would have to fly are coming well within range of Russian land-based ballistic missiles and conceivably before long artillery systems. They are not so far behind the front lines that they would have to be attacked using cruise missiles, air-launched cruise missiles, be they subsonic KH-101s or calibres, or alternatively hypersonic Kinjal missiles, such as the missiles that the Russians have been using up to this time. And of course, if the Russians advance further and the airfield near Mirgorod comes within artillery range, then, in my opinion, it will become completely unusable. It won't be just any longer a question of drone attacks and aircraft and airstrikes and even ballistic missile attacks. If an airfield is constantly and repeatedly shelled using tube artillery and multiple launch rocket systems, then it can no longer be used to operate fighter jets. It is as simple as that. Now, why, however, have the Ukrainians been deploying fighter jets in a place like Mirgorod, which appears to be so close to the front lines? The only explanation I can come up with is that the Russian breakthrough in Kharkiv region and the various talks and discussions that have taken place on the part of Ukraine and its Western sponsors about launching a counteroffensive in Kharkiv region have dictated the need for Ukraine to deploy aircraft to provide some degree of air cover to the Ukrainian troops fighting in Kharkiv region who are trying to hold back the Russians. And I've discussed in previous programs how the Russians seem to have successfully shot down several MiG-29 fighter jets operating over Kharkiv region, presumably taking off from this airfield in Mirnograd and another airfield west of Kharkiv city near Poltava, and how the Russians have also shot down. They now say, the Russian Air Defense Ministry summary on Friday claimed that the Russians have shot down in mid-flight 8 Patriot air defense missiles launched from the ground, presumably at Russian aerial targets, I'm guessing also in the Kharkiv region. Well, it looks as if the Russians are now targeting the airfields from which these aircraft, these Ukrainian aircraft that are trying to support the Ukrainian troops in Kharkiv, are taking off. And it seems to me, when I said that the Russians will soon, may soon be in a position to launch artillery strikes upon the airfield in Mirnograd, we are probably coming fairly close to that time. It might be a few weeks away, because the Russians, as the Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed, now securely hold Novo-Alexandrovka, west of Ocheretino. They are apparently now advancing towards Vozvyzhenka, the next village, which is located immediately to the south of the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, and by the way to Toretsk as well, along which the Ukrainians keep their forces in these places supplied. And the Russians, having apparently also captured Sokol, another village, and Yevgenivka, are now almost on the outskirts of a further village called Progress, which is part of the wider urban conurbation, the center of which is Pokrovsk. So the Russians are now coming close to that point where they're not only able to cut the road along which the Ukrainians send most of their supplies to their troops in Toretsk and some of their supplies to the troops in Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, but they're also in a position where they can start shelling the airfield in Mirnograd from which the Ukrainian aircraft are taking off in order to support operations in Kharkiv region. And the Russian advance in this area is looking unstoppable. Whenever we see pauses, which sometimes do last, say, a week, it's not, in my opinion, because of Ukrainian resistance. I think that the Ukrainians obviously are able to reinforce their troops to a certain extent in this area, but not in any big way. And most of the troops, the reinforcements that they send to this area now appear to be poorly trained reservists. And it's clear that there are no major fortified lines, no major fortifications in this area that they can fall back on. The reason that there are occasional operational pauses is that the Russians have now advanced a substantial distance away from their main supply centers in Donetsk, Donetsk city, and Avdiivka itself. And they have to build up the supplies, the immediately to the rear of their vanguard forces in order to ensure that their troops in the field who are carrying out these advances are properly equipped and properly supplied to engage with the Ukrainian defenders. And in various programs, I've discussed the importance of the supply roads and of the railway lines. It's likely, even as we discuss all of these Russian advances, that the Russians are working very hard on clearing the railways, sorting out the railway lines from Donetsk to Avdiivka, and beyond Avdiivka, perhaps to Ocheretino. If the Russians are able to get these railways working at some point over the next few weeks, well, of course, the supply situation will transform completely. And at that point, we are going to see the tempo of Russian advances accelerate even further. And to reiterate again, bringing railways into a condition of repair is never as complicated a task as some people appear to imagine, though of course the Russians will not want to send trains with large numbers of weapons and explosives into areas where the Ukrainians might still be able to launch drone attacks upon them, causing damage to the trains, which might lead to massive explosions and loss of material and obviously deaths of personnel. So it's not just a question of repairing the railways, it is of moving the Ukrainians a further distance away so that the railways can operate smoothly and with some elements of safety. And again, I suspect that the Russians are getting gradually closer to that point as well. So this is an operational crisis. I've discussed many times how following the fall of Avdiivka, the Russians have in effect punched a massive hole in the Ukrainian defense lines. We see how that hole is widening all the time. The defense lines have been breached at their strongest point. The Ukrainians are throwing troops to try to hold the Russians back in every location in this breakthrough area, but they are failing and they're suffering catastrophic losses in the process. And various people, Dima at the Military Summary Channel being one, has spoken also about the enormous losses in terms of equipment, tanks, armoured vehicles and such things that the Ukrainians have experienced in precisely this same area where the Russians have created this breach. Now, we've received more news over the last few hours about the widening of this breach. I discussed yesterday how the Russians appear to have fully captured Sokol and have captured the greater part of Yevgenivka. Even more dramatic news has been received further south, but in the same general area. It looks like the village of Yasnobrodovka has fallen. The Russian Ministry of Defense presumably will confirm this fairly soon. But perhaps more remarkable of all, it looks as if the Russians have achieved some kind of breakthrough further south still in the village of Karlovka. Now, Karlovka lies along various big reservoirs, water barriers, which some people thought would slow down the Russians. And no doubt they have slowed down the Russians, but not very much, because it looks as if the Russians have successfully penetrated Ukrainian defenses in Karlovka and are overcoming whatever obstacles these water barriers represented. Now, to be clear, no one is saying that Karlovka has yet fallen under Russian control, but it is looking increasingly likely that it will. Once Karlovka falls, the Russians will have broken through what, to all intents and purposes, is the last major defense line before Pokrovsk itself. From that moment on, the way towards an advance on Pokrovsk from the south will be open. And not just Pokrovsk, the fall of Karlovka will also facilitate the Russian offensive further south in Krasnogorovka. And again, we've received more reports of the Russians making further advances in Krasnogorovka. They appear to be clearing a large rectangular area where the Ukrainians apparently kept some of their artillery within Krasnogorovka. This appears to have been some kind of park area, some kind of recreational park. These areas, by the way, can be difficult to capture. I remember reading years ago an account of the Battle of Berlin in 1945, and I remember reading then that the Germans had turned the Tiergarten, the big park area in central Berlin, into a major part of their fortifications, and that they had tanks and troops located in this garden area, in this park area, and that the German troops in the Tiergarten were able to delay or slow down the advance of the Red Army on the nearby Reichstag and Reich Chancellery buildings. This is, of course, in the Battle of Berlin. I'm not suggesting that anything on anything like that kind of scale is taking place in Krasnogorovka. But anyway, whatever, the Russians seem to be clearing this park area as well. So Krasnogorovka is about to fall. I think virtually everyone now concedes this, including the Ukrainians themselves. The Ukrainians seem to be retreating from Krasnogorovka. Krasnogorovka falls and Karlovka falls. It won't just be the way to Pokrovsk that will be open. It'll be the way to Kurachovo as well. The Russians have been advancing in Maximilianovka, village immediately to the west of Kurachovo, just about 10 kilometers away from Kurachovo. They are now confirmed as having broken into Konstantinovka, another village in the same general area defended by the stalwart 72nd Brigade of the Ukrainian army. The Russians seem to be making significant progress in this area as well. But as I said, it is perhaps in the area to the west of Ocheretino and Avdiivka, in the direction towards Pokrovsk, that the big operational crisis for the Ukrainians is coming. And if we now move further eastwards from Avdiivka, we've seen that over the last couple of days, the Russians have achieved this big breakthrough in the Toretsk area, but we've now had further reports of more Russian advances further north in what is perhaps the most difficult battle of all, the one where the fighting is conceivably most intense of all, which is Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians seem to have concentrated many of their best troops to try to defend Chasiv Yar, and they appear to have become concerned that in the event that Chasiv Yar falls, the subsequent towns of Konstantinovka and Druzhnaya to the west of Chasiv Yar, which lie on low ground, will fall rapidly, and that will open the way for the Russians to attack both Kramatorsk, the southern city of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, and perhaps even advance westwards towards the Dnieper itself. Just saying. But anyway, the Ukrainians seem to have concentrated many of their best troops in Chasiv Yar. I've been saying that the Russians appear to be close to clearing the micro-district to the west of the aqueduct, of the aqueduct in Chasiv Yar. Yesterday I spoke about, or was it the day before, I spoke about the fact that the Russians appear to have captured significant amount of territory east of the aqueduct on the northern flanks of Chasiv Yar, and to have sent troops across the aqueduct in this area as well. We've now received more reports about this. The Russians seem to have advanced further northward from the village of Kalinina and have reached another village north of Kalinina, but immediately east of the aqueduct called Georgievka. A huge area along the aqueduct, in other words, is now north of Chasiv Yar, is falling under Russian control. And it looks as if, even as the micro-district falls, the Russians, who have already managed to deploy at least some troops to the west of the aqueduct on this northern flank, that the Russians are now in a position to advance on a wide front west of the aqueduct when the moment comes and achieve a breakthrough, conceivably cutting off Chasiv Yar's supply lines to the north, but also conceivably acting to encircle or at any rate to outflank Ukrainian defences in the northern part of Chasiv Yar by attacking Chasiv Yar from the north. And it seems to me that if we do get such a major offensive in this direction as well, then it's highly likely that Chasiv Yar would collapse rapidly, however intense the Ukrainian defences are in this city also. And then last but not least, since we're talking about the situation, on the battlefronts, we are getting increasing amounts of news from Kharkiv region, from Volchansk. There's now further confirmation of the presence of Russian troops in the area of the high-rise buildings. It's clear that the Russians do not control the whole of the high-rise buildings. We see film of Russian troops fighting in the high-rise buildings, but the fighting in the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk appears to be very intense, and one gets the sense that the spearhead assault groups that the Russians have in the area of the high-rise buildings have to be resupplied from the air by drones, which is now becoming, by the way, an increasingly common thing in this war. But the point is that even as the Russians have now deployed armor into Volchansk, have apparently captured, if not all of the aggregate plant, but a significant part of it, as they've broken into the high-rise building area of Volchansk, we're getting reports that they have also advanced and captured important territories immediately to the west of Volchansk, and it's increasingly looking as if they're preparing for some kind of major encirclement or at least outflanking operations of the Ukrainians in Volchansk itself. It is truly astonishing how all of this is happening at incredible speed. The tempo of the Russian offensive is intensifying. I don't get the sense that there are yet major commitments by the Russians of all of their available reserves. But I saw a report that the Ukrainians themselves believe that there are 500,000 Russian troops operating in the territory, within the territory of, shall we say, pre-2014 Ukraine. And that's to say in Donbass, in Kharkiv region, in Zaporozhye, in Kherson region. 500,000 Russian troops backed by aircraft, armor, artillery, with apparently all but unlimited supplies of ammunition. Aircraft, of course, now increasingly operating using heavy bombs, not just Fab 1500s and 500s, but Fab 3000s as well. Recently, by the way, an airstrike was carried out by the Russians in the Toretsk area in central Donbass using a Fab 3000 bomb. So these are now starting to spread across the line of contact. I discount, by the way, the theory that there's only two Russian fighter jets able to drop these bombs. I suspect that gradually more and more of them are being converted to do so. Though, as I said, it's likely that we're probably going to get around a dozen or a score of Russian fighter bombers operating these bombs. The Russians have apparently around 160 Sukhoi 34s. The bulk will continue to drop the smaller bombs, which are sufficient for the vast majority of purposes. But anyway, regardless, the Russians probably have around 500,000 men along the battle lines. Probably only half of these are fighting at any one point in time, but the Ukrainians are believed to have around 300,000. They are increasingly outnumbered and outgunned right across the line of contact, and their defences are crumbling. And talk of offensives from the Ukrainians, about which we were hearing so much just 2 weeks ago, well, they've melted away like the mist on a hot summer's day. Just to say. Now, unsurprisingly, all of this is causing tensions in Ukraine. We have growing complaints from Ukrainian soldiers on the battle lines about the incompetence of their generals. We're getting reports that President Zelensky is becoming disillusioned with General Syrskyi and is increasingly blaming him for the failures on the battlefronts, even though, as far as I can see, General Syrskyi has just done all the things that President Zelensky asked him to do. In particular, General Syrskyi sent reinforcements continuously to try to not just hold the Russians back in Avdiivka, in Ocheretino, in Berdichi, in Stepovoye, in Toninka, in Orlovka, and all of these places, but he tried to launch counterattacks in these areas, which is an incredibly reckless thing to do, and the result has been massive equipment and manpower losses, and no doubt the speed of the Russian advances west of Ocheretino are at least partly in consequence of this. But to reiterate again, it is Zelensky himself who has been endlessly urging Syrskyi and the other Ukrainian commanders to go onto the attack. If we go back a few weeks, we were getting reports of Zelensky screaming at his generals, believing that they were lying to him about the situation in Kharkiv region. It looks as if it was Zelensky who was demanding some kind of a counterattack in Kharkiv region to drive back the Russians across the border and perhaps even take Belgorod itself before the NATO summit meeting, which begins on the 9th of July. And of course, all that these tactics have done is that they have weakened the Ukrainians further in the face of overwhelming Russian strength. And the Russians, according to Putin, have 700,000 men in this general area, so they have not yet committed the greater part of their reserves. And it's still the case, or so it seems to me, that a major offensive using armoured forces has not yet been launched on the battlefronts, as perhaps it will at some point over the next few weeks. So, criticism in Kiev by the politicians of the military. Now, Zelensky today is receiving a person who I suspect is an increasingly unwelcome visitor. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who is now chair of the EU, Hungary has now assumed the presidency of the EU, despite the attempts of several people to prevent that, and whose position has been significantly reinforced by the victories of the anti-war right-wing parties in Germany, in the European parliamentary elections, shortly in France as well, but also elsewhere. Anyway, Viktor Orban, who now looks a great deal less isolated, who has a stable alliance now with Robert Fico in Slovakia, who's now recovering from his assassination attempt, and who might before long also have another ally if the Freedom Party wins the parliamentary elections in Austria. Anyway, he's now come to Kiev. And I suspect that the purpose of Orban's visit to Kiev, first and foremost, is to try to talk some sense into Zelensky, to try to explain to Zelensky that really the game is over. Time is running out. The writing is on the wall. You can choose whatever metaphor you choose. But there is really no further way of continuing this war. With the electoral debate debacle in the United States, it's becoming increasingly unlikely that President Biden is going to be re-elected. The president's opponent, Donald Trump, is once more speaking very skeptically about the war and about the West's support for Ukraine. What I think Viktor Orban is going to try to do over the course of this visit is try to knock some sense into Zelensky, try to get Zelensky to understand that everything that he has tried in military terms, in economic terms, where Ukraine is going down fast through that disastrous peace summit that just took place in Switzerland, everything that he has tried has failed, and that time is running out. Orban's trip might be the last chance Zelensky has to try to change course and to move towards negotiations. We will see whether Orban is successful. I very much doubt it, I have to say. I get the sense that Zelensky is past the point of reasoned discussion. We will see what happens, but that is a topic I'm going to discuss in my next program, which will be tomorrow. So let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you will still find that we're still doing our Football 21 series. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.